Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, a Pittsburgh Steelers podcast made by fans like you, for fans like you. Now, here's your host, Joe Kuzma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. I am your host, Joe Kuzma, and that is at Joe_Kuzma on Twitter for those of you following me over on my personal account, which aren't very many people, and that's okay because I just started it not too long ago. You weren't seeing things. I was up by or at the Mistake on the Lake up in Cleveland, and it's no longer a mistake on the lake, the Believeland, all of that stuff seemingly vanishing overnight. As a Northeast Ohio resident, as most of you know, I live in a house divided with my wife being a Cleveland Browns fan, myself, of course, a rabid Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and many people in my family split down the middle, one side or the other. But when it comes to hockey and it comes to the NBA, we are a family united, as Pittsburgh doesn't have an NBA team, nor does Cleveland have an NHL team. So friends and family get together, and boy, have we had one heck of a roller coaster ride as this month just continues to roll on, first with the Pittsburgh Penguins hoisting Lord Stanley's Cup and just having that giant parade. And you know what, being a part of the couple of those games there in Consol Energy Center for the Eastern Conference Finals. Didn't make it to any of the Stanley Cup final games, but you know what, that's okay too. I'll tell you what, being a part of that, just absolutely awesome. Seeing one of the greatest in the game, like Sidney Crosby, he ends up getting the Conn Smythe Trophy, and, you know, all is good in the world. Then, being a lifelong Cleveland Cavs fan, and please don't hold it against me. It's okay. I know there's some hard feelings, and there's plenty of people who are Steelers fans who do support the Cavs. But, you know, I had so many emotions with LeBron first coming to the Cavs, and I was very big on that. And, you know, he leaves, and you hate him, and then he comes back, and I understand that's just a roller coaster ride on its own. But just like Sid, LeBron getting the MVP and just bringing back that NBA championship to the city, both cities very similar. It's going to be interesting to see how they party earlier this week. I wonder if they'll party as hard as Pittsburgh. I'll tell you what, I don't think in either city there's going to be anyone working at any of these jobs. How do people get time off or do whatever? I mean, wow, everybody's got a cold or their head hurts, heart hurts, got to go to the ER. I'm not sure what it is, but I'll tell you what, that's just simply the coolest thing right now, just happening to be like smack dab in the middle between both cities and having my family all rejoice together in both the hockey and the basketball championships and seeing both of these great players and being a part of both of these championship teams. Now, I'm just hoping that I have a third championship coming this year when the Pittsburgh Steelers are on their way to the stairway to 7. And, of course, to do that, they have to build this 53-man roster and, you know, just pretty much build the arsenal that they need to have the weapons to go after that Lombardi Trophy. And let me tell you what, I wrote a pretty neat article over on SteelCityUnderground.com the other day, and it did actually extremely well. And I'm not sure if that's just because of the title, which was 6 players in danger of not making the Steelers roster in 2016. Not sure if it was the title that really got people's interest or the picture of Ross Ventrone. Of course, Ross Ventrone is the first player on my list as the Steelers player who may have his roster spot in jeopardy for this upcoming season in the 53-man cuts. And you know, I got a little bit of flack for even using Ross's picture. No, not Ross Ventrone. I love Ross Ventrone. And Ross Ventrone's only been on 2 teams. He's been with the New England Patriots. And they initially kept him after he was a college free agent, went undrafted in 2010. In the following year, in 2011, I mean, the Patriots organization had 21 transactions just in that year alone with Ross Ventrone. And a lot of people are calling him the human yo-yo, or I call him a boomerang, because the guy, you can't get rid of him. He's just like a bad odor in your car. If you ever seen that Seinfeld episode and he couldn't get rid of the stench that was in his vehicle, that's kind of Ross Ventrone, except I don't think Ross Ventrone stinks, so to speak. But Ross Ventrone has had, and I had the number here, 41 transactions in the NFL where he has been signed, promoted, or released by either the New England Patriots or Pittsburgh Steelers. And I'm going to put a little buyer beware out here. Before I actually wrote this article, the NFL had yet to decide what they were going to do with practice squads in 2016 for this upcoming season. The previous year or two, they had extended and they amended, and they've actually been expanding the practice squads because after a player accrues so many seasons in the NFL, and I believe it's 2 seasons, and that has to be 6 games within any one season that they're on the active roster or something. I have to get the actual rundown. If you need it, the whole thing is listed. You can find it online at Behind the Steel Curtain. My buddy, the editor, Jeff Hartman, just put out a neat little article on that. I want to say that was Friday. And the news had just come out. As soon as I'd published this article, I'd amended it with a little footnote at the bottom. So I thought that Ross Ventrone, of course, a lot of people confusing him on special teams as Troy Polamalu with having the longer hair, even though he was a little smaller than Troy. And, of course, he wears number 35, so it's not a little hard to mistake him for Troy. But Ross would bounce back and forth on this team. He would initially make the team, and then he would get cut in order to bring Martavis Bryant back from suspension after he was gone for the first 4 games of the 2015 season. And then he would end up back with the New England Patriots and then come back off of their practice squad back to the Steelers' active roster, where he was activated for the final game against the Cleveland Browns. That was his 41st transaction, and Ross come through with the playoffs and et cetera, et cetera. So even though there is a lack of depth at the safety position, Ross Ventrone could be one of these guys that ends up not making the 53-man roster, though the expanded practice squad rules, which I had originally stated the original rules that may have went into effect with 2016 and not these new expanded ones, may have made Ross ineligible, or the Steelers would have had to make a tough choice because they'd have to keep 2 accrued guys versus now they are permitted to have 4. So Ross may still stick around either on the active roster and continue to bounce back and forth, being demoted and promoted as they see fit. However, I think there's a spot for Ross not only with the safety depth, but also being a special teams standout, unlike the next name, who is a constant hot seat, hot button topic here on the Steel City Underground podcast. And if you ever catch me over on Twitter with the Steel City Underground account, we're always talking about Shamarko Thomas. Pretty much, I hate to label people a bust, but he has certainly been underwhelming, had all the opportunities in the world to come in as expected. The expectation for Sharknado was when he came into the 2013 NFL draft and the Steelers moved up. Well, they actually didn't even move up a few picks. They still kept their original pick at 115, but they would trade with the Cleveland Browns the first time those franchises had actually swapped picks or made any type of transaction like that in 45 years, just to go up at 111, 4 picks earlier to pick Shamarko Thomas. And then, of course, pick 115 was Landry Jones. So a lot of people had already been proclaiming Shamarko Thomas as Troy Polamalu's eventual heir or replacement. And even Troy took him under his wing, and it just seems like it just hasn't quite, the light bulb hasn't gone off for Shamarko, and unfortunately, he doesn't have a whole lot of time left for that light to go off. I do feel that he may be expendable, and someone like Ross Ventrone would be someone that I would much rather have on my 53-man roster, knowing that at least on special teams, you're not going to make some boneheaded mistakes, such as what ends up happening is Thomas played a lot on special teams last year. He actually had the second most snaps at 285 as opposed to special teams captain Robert Golden, who was the first with 310. But Thomas was penalized on 3 separate occasions on special teams for 45 yards of penalties for a fair catch interference and an interference with opportunity to catch. In the first one, the fair catch interference, he actually committed that penalty twice, and he was the only Steeler on the roster to be penalized for either infraction last season, and he got penalized for the one twice. So that's 3 penalties that no other Steeler on the roster had committed. I do think He's on very thin ice. Don't make any mistake about it. Mike Tomlin and his group, his staff, he's got several former head coaches on this staff, and I'm going to talk about this, I believe, sometime in the near future. It's on my little task list that I have here when it comes to my upcoming episodes. And, Todd Haley and Mike Munchak, and, formerly he had Dick LeBeau, so even, Thomas played under Dick LeBeau. How can you be such an undisciplined player this many years in, and of course also fighting some injury bugs and things like that? I do think Shamarko Thomas is an expendable player for the 2015 season. Another guy, of course, who came up in my 2016 predictions on offense and the defense. Still have to catch up with Eric Herman and get this defense deal done. But on the offensive side, we were talking about tight ends. And one of those guys is kind of the flex position, fullback / tight end / H-back, whatever you want to call it. That would be David Johnson, who was originally with the Pittsburgh Steelers, left and had two just not very good seasons, unmemorable seasons over with the San Diego Chargers. So Will Johnson, as you know, would be that guy that would come in maybe on some of the jumbo packages, maybe have like a half dozen to dozen targets during a season, might catch a couple passes. If you actually remember, Ben Roethlisberger got picked off in that one game. Was that the Cincinnati Bengals game? I'm trying to think which one it was now, where Will Johnson, it was either that or the Broncos game. I'm trying to remember which one it was. And he tried to target Will Johnson and actually got picked off, and it nearly cost him the game there. And anyways, I'm rambling on that because it seems like there's always this need for this versatile type player, especially on Todd Haley's offense. And of course, the more jobs you can do, probably the more versatile you're going to be, and the more demand there's going to be for your services in the NFL if you could do more than one job. We're just talking about two safeties in Ross Ventrone and Shamarko Thomas, who play safety, but also need to be special teams contributors in order to make this roster, because not everyone's going to get out there and be part of that starting 11 or even part of that rotation in the sub packages. And that's kind of where I think David Johnson lies right now, because you still have a veteran in Matt Spaeth. You have Ladarius Green, who was just signed as a free agent at the tight end position, and he may be the starter. And there's also a lot of speculation as to whether or not Ladarius Green will just kind of be used as like a wide receiver, and Jesse James becomes that full-time type tight end to replace Heath Miller. And that's of course that's possible, but we're so far early into this season, there's no telling for sure until you start to see exactly what type of snaps and reps these guys are taking. So of course that leaves another guy that's in camp. Well, there's Xavier Grimble, who's been bouncing around a few teams. A lot of people are kind of high on him, but I think he's on the outside looking in. You have Matt Spaeth, who is a former veteran, and actually one of the other former veteran. That's not what I meant to say. Matt Spaeth is one of these guys that's been around for a very long time, and he's starting to maybe be long in the tooth. Very good blocker, not a guy really known for catching passes or anything like that. And he had a little bit of got banged up a couple times last season, and that's kind of where I wonder, Matt Spaeth's actually the next name on the list. And when you talk about David Johnson and Matt Spaeth maybe competing for one of those spots, it depends on how many receivers and linebackers the Steelers are going to keep, because they're loaded at both positions. And I thought it was really a novelty last year that they kept not only just Will Johnson, but they've converted Roosevelt Nix over to be a fullback, the Kent State product. So they actually had like two fullbacks on the roster. And I thought Roosevelt Nix was one of the guys that might get cut because it's just kind of like one of these project players. Well, we also saw Tyler Murphy was a project, being a quarterback converted to a wide receiver, and the Steelers seemed enamored enough with him he was on the active roster a little bit. I believe he was the fifth wide receiver entering the season, and he got cut, dropped to the practice squad, called back up, of course, to be the backup quarterback when Landry Jones was the only guy left on the roster due to injuries, with Michael Vick and Ben Roethlisberger still trying to heal. So that probably sounded like an auctioneer right there. I just belted that one out. But what I'm trying to get at is, can the Steelers once again afford to keep an H-back and a fullback on this roster? It'll be very interesting to see. And I think that's where we find out where David Johnson lies, And that's where we find out where Matt Spaeth is. And I think Matt Spaeth actually does stay and stick with this roster. If they feel they want to get rid of a player a year early instead of a year late, and we've seen the Steelers hang on to some guys maybe a year longer than they should, especially guys that we love. And Matt Spaeth has a pretty cap-friendly $137,500 in dead money if he's released. That's a drop in the bucket when we're talking about salary caps and whatnot. But at the same time, that means Matt Spaeth is one heck of a bargain as a veteran hand that could come in there and help you out, even if he's not playing the amount of snaps that he used to. If you want to work in the younger Jesse James and start to see what the future looks like at the tight end position. So Matt Spaeth, David Johnson, very interesting to see what happens with those two players. And in fact, speaking of being loaded at wide receiver, it's not often that you think of a 7th-round draft choice as being a lock to make the roster. And that's the way I feel with DeMarcus Ayers, who is strictly chosen, and the Steelers made no bones about letting everybody know about this. He was chosen to be a kick returner. And we all know they're trying to supplant Antonio Brown and get him off of the punt return duties. And I think that's a whole other topic too, because Antonio Brown, you see a lot of these different teams that have some high quality players. We were bringing it up the other day. I was talking with Eric, and we're talking about like Patrick Peterson with the Cardinals, and he returned some kicks. And there's a few other guys. I should say punts. Punt return team's a little bit different than the kick return team, a little bit different dynamics to it and the way it works. And, of course, the Steelers, they're just going to throw – the way the kick return is right now is just a mess. And pretty much everyone's either booting it out of the end zone. Now teams are going to start the 25, so it'll be interesting to see if they kick it short. And once again, that's a whole other topic. But the Steelers aren't necessarily locked in, but it's safe to say that if somebody like a Fitzgerald Toussaint's on this roster, or any of the backup running backs or wide receivers, pretty much anybody that they could put Sammy Coates back there, or Darius Hayward-Bay, or most of these guys are just going to take a knee. So when you look at it from that aspect, and you have a 7th-round draft choice invested in DeMarcus Ayers, there's a lot of competition for that final spot. And I went over this just recently in a podcast and article within the last week or two about the wide receiver depth charts, and there's 11 guys in camp. And there's probably a solid, besides Ayers, he has 2 solid competitors, Shaquem Phillips and Eli Rogers. Eli Rogers hurting his foot last season, signing a futures contract and sticking with the team and hopefully making it on. A lot of people are very high on Eli Rogers, and it appears he has a lot of potential. At the same time, when you look and see what Shaquem Phillips was able to do and, raise some eyebrows to his play last preseason, I think he makes a solid case for himself too. So DeMarcus Ayers already starting behind the 8 ball, even though, unlike Eli Rogers and Phillips, he was actually drafted, where the other 2 are undrafted guys. But Rogers and DeMarcus Ayers, a little bit smaller guys, as I had noted. Shaquem Phillips, a little bit bigger and also faster in his 40 time. But fast in that speed with the 40 isn't always everything. I mean, look at Antonio Brown. Antonio Brown's fast, but Antonio Brown is shifty. So, and Antonio Brown also a 6th-round draft choice. So you just never know what's going to happen. But he's already coming into camp with 2 guys just gunning for his job. And depending on how many receivers the Steelers keep, there may only be 1 spot for 3 guys or more, because we also don't know who might be the next guy to make a name for themselves in the preseason. Could be one other guy. And also on offense, and speaking of a logjam of players, particularly on the offensive line, I feel Chris Hubbard is maybe the last guy of these 6 that may be fighting for his very survival on the Steelers roster. Chris Hubbard, of course, is an undrafted guard from Alabama, Birmingham, and he's going to find himself fighting not only, last season he was battling with Alejandro Villanueva, who comes out and he's the left tackle. And Chris Hubbard could play anywhere along the line. And you see that the Steelers signed Ryan Harris, who started all 16 games at left tackle for the Denver Broncos. And they also drafted Gerald Hawkins in the 4th round. So when you consider both of those players, it's kind of difficult to see exactly where Chris Hubbard may fit in on this roster. And that's because the Steelers already have Cody Wallace, And it was Marquise Pouncey who went down and got injured in the preseason that made way for Cody Wallace to be the starting center, and he did a pretty good job as a center. So Cody Wallace can play center and guard just as much as Chris Hubbard can also play center. But I'm thinking that the extra 2 tackles that the Steelers brought on, in addition to Alejandro Villanueva, gives them 2 guys that could play as a swing tackle, and Cody Wallace is already a guard. And if you look at Pouncey coming back, you've already got 8 offensive linemen, and that just makes for a log jam and a bottleneck at the position, just like with the wide receivers. There's just not enough spots open or that may be available for Chris Hubbard to be signed to the 53-man roster. I did think before the news of the new practice squad policies coming out with the NFL that Chris Hubbard could be another casualty. I didn't think that when the practice squad rules only allowed for 2 players with accrued seasons, and I do believe that Chris Hubbard did achieve the accrued seasons being on the active roster last year, that there would be room for both Hubbard and Ventrone in the event that the Steelers found another player that may have had some accrued seasons. It would have been a third guy and would have bumped one of those guys off the roster. However, now, with the ability to carry 4 guys such as that on the practice squad, you might still find that Chris Hubbard is at least part of the practice squad, but maybe not a member of the actual 53-man roster. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a very, very long evening for me. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. We got some really good camp battles. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you for your support. Thank you for listening. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe or share and tell a friend. Let them know, hey, you know what? This guy knows what he's talking about. Or, you know, if I'm full of it, just tell him that too. That's cool. But as always, be safe, be good, and I will catch you later.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.